Hello, this is Matilda Wood for History 300. I'm doing my final presentation over sharecropping and the factors that kept farmers tied to this system. Right here is my thesis statement. Sharecroppers like my McAllister and Coslow ancestors played an important role in the agricultural industry of the past. Sharecropping was a difficult occupation that often provided little opportunity for advancement. There are significant factors that kept these workers bound to sharecropping. Familiarity, financial dependence, and limited education are all contributing factors to why many families, such as my own, continued to work as sharecroppers. Sometimes in the study of history, we can forget that the events and the situations covered involve regular people just like you and I. Their circumstance may be extraordinary or unique, but the people involved are just regular people, just like us. And it was important to me at the front of my project to put a face with the group of people that I'll be discussing, sharecroppers. So here are some photos of my great great grandparents. These are my mother's grandparents, Clifford Lee and Hattie Coslow McAllister. They both worked as sharecroppers. Before I got into the factors that I discussed in my thesis, the things that kept the farmers bound to sharecropping, I thought it was important to provide some background information on what sharecropping is, why states would want to use it, and what this meant for the reality of the sharecropping farmer. Okay, to begin, it's important to have a foundation and a little bit of an understanding of what sharecropping is. This is a bit of a paraphrase on my part of a take from the New Georgia Encyclopedia, but they define sharecropping as an agricultural labor system where laborers with no land of their own farm land owned by someone else, usually a large landowner. At harvest time, when the crop would come in, these workers would be paid with a share of the crop. So there's your name of the system, sharecropping. This began in the U.S. South after Reconstruction, so post Civil War, and lasted until the 1950s. So, why would southern states, my research focuses on the specific state of Georgia, but why would these southern states be interested in a farming system like sharecropping? Well, it all comes down to money. Sharecropping was said to be more productive than other kinds of farming, which meant that they were able to produce more product, which would in turn result in a bigger profit being made. And it was also desirable because the labor, the workers, it was cheap labor. They paid them with a portion of the crop. So it was up to them to take that portion and turn it into actual cash, actual currency that they could use. And the system was set up to keep the laborers dependent on the system, which meant they didn't have to worry about losing their labor force. We'll get into more of that a little bit later. But ultimately, it comes down to it was beneficial for landowners. It made the landowners money. And so that's why the southern states were interested in a system like sharecropping. On March 31st of 2020, as part of my family history oral interview, I was able to have a telephone conversation with my grandfather's first cousin, Miss Sue Coslow Harris. What you're about to hear is a small piece of that where she describes some of the sharecropping done by our family.
My family, as most of the families in this area, were just poor sharecroppers, and the landowner would supply the dwelling, and the tenant would supply the seed, the equipment, the labor, and cotton was the prime crop. But in the fall and harvest time, the tenant would get 3/4 of the income, and the landowner would get a fourth. But that was called three-fourths farming, but the farmer had to spend all the money, and I guess the fourth that the landowner got was just because he owned the land. He didn't really have to put any expense in the growing of the crop.
While initially working as a sharecropper may have appeared to offer some positives, you have a landowner who is offering employment and shelter, a place to stay. In reality, sharecropping was very difficult. It was a very challenging life. You had very hard labor, very little pay, very little chance for advancement. It is said that the only people that had it harder than white sharecroppers were African Americans, and sharecroppers have been described as forgotten Americans. It was a very difficult way of life. Right. Something that's very important to understand about sharecropping is that the whole system is based on a cycle of debt. An immediate downside of sharecropping is that the laborers found themselves in debt before their first crop had ever been harvested. They start out in the negative. It's like they start out with the cards stacked against them. Anything that the farmers may need was bought on credit, either from the landowner they worked for or from participating stores. My grandfather's sister shared with me that there were only two stores in our area that would do business with sharecroppers. They couldn't just go in any store and get on credit the items that they needed. They could only work with stores that would work with them. The things they might get could be the tools and seed needed for farming, so they would have to buy on credit the things they needed to do their job, or it may be things that they needed just for everyday living, things like food and clothing. This was all done with the understanding that the laborer, the farmer, would pay back what they owed once their crop had come in and they had sold their crop for money. Then they would use that money to pay back what they had owed at the store or to the landowner. But if the crop failed or they were unable to sell their part of the crop, then their debt would just continue to grow. They would have to continue to buy on credit until the next harvest came in. If the crop was successful and they were able to sell their portion of the crop, they were left with very little money, if any money, after paying for the things that they had got on credit. They were left with very little. This cycle of buying on credit and paying back in the future left these sharecroppers almost constantly in debt. This made it incredibly difficult to build savings or to get ahead in life. If you're constantly having to borrow for the things that you need and then pay back when your little bit of money comes in, it's impossible to get ahead. So now that we have our background information and we're familiar with what sharecropping is, and we know more about why the states use it, why would somebody get involved in this? Why would somebody become a sharecropper? If it's all set up to benefit the large landowner and make them money, and the worker, the farmer themselves, has a very difficult life, they make very little money, they function within this cycle of constant debt. Why would somebody sign up for this? So that brings us to my thesis statement, the significant factors that lead families to sharecropping and keep them bound to it once they've entered the system. Well, the key factors I would like to look at are familiarity, financial dependence, and limited education. When it comes to the factor of familiarity, it's simply a case of people doing what they know. Oftentimes, sharecropping may be the only or one of the primary forms of income for an area. So people that live in this area are surrounded by sharecropping. That's what's familiar to them. That's what they know. Oftentimes, sharecroppers may be recruited by neighbors or other family members to begin working with them. People were familiar with farming, they understood working with the land. It's simply what was available to them. In another selection from my family history telephone interview, cousin Sue Costello Harris speaks on sharecropping being one of the main jobs available in our area. This is important because it shows that people here could have easily turned to sharecropping simply because they were exposed to it. They were surrounded by it as a form of employment.
they had to support itself by farming. But now, most anybody that grew up on a farm didn't want to continue farming. They would try to get them a job somewhere else because it was
Right,
such hard work. So
right,
they'd go to the neighboring cities and work in the cotton mills or the factories.
right. That seems to be what I'm finding in my studies is farming or mill work is what
That was
people.
about was all around then.
The pictures here show three generations of sharecroppers in the McAllister family. Starting on the right, I have my grandfather, Rene McAllister. In the middle, his father, Clifford Lee McAllister. And on the left, Clifford's father, George Monroe McAllister. This is important to familiarity because I know in the case of Rene, he sharecropped because his father sharecropped, and I would be willing to bet that Clifford got into sharecropping the same way because that's what his father did. And that was true for many sharecroppers. They got into it because that's what their fathers did, that's what their families did, that's what they knew. Another factor that kept farmers tied to sharecropping was the factor of financial dependence. We've already talked about in our background information how the sharecropping itself is based on a system of keeping the farmer in a cycle of debt. But in addition to that, there are other factors that led to financial dependence, and one of those is just large family size. In my own family's case, my grandfather was one of 13 children. He was the fifth of 13 children. When you have a family that size, it definitely affects your finances. You know, you can't just leave sharecropping and go find a different kind of job whenever you want to because you have 13 children. In that case, a household of 15 people, depending on that income for their food, for their clothing, for anything they may need. Um, some interesting points I wanted to bring out in sharecropping families, it was not uncommon for the woman to sharecrop alongside her husband, as my great grandmother did with her husband. Women, in sharecropping families didn't get to stay home and tend to the house; they were in the fields working with their husband because of financial need. Also the children. Oftentimes, it was common for children to leave school early so that they could join the fields and farm to help bring in extra income. It was all about, you know, getting more family to farm in order to increase the income. I mean, when you have that many children in a family that size to support, it's almost impossible to get ahead financially in that situation. Here we have a picture of my great grandfather, Clifford Lee McAllister. He's wearing the hat. Surrounded by 11 of his 13 children and one grandchild. And this just helps give you a visual of how many children there were, how many mouths to feed, how many to keep clothed. And the family story is, and in this family, there were 10 sons and 3 daughters. And all of the boys could not go to school on the same days because they only had so many pairs of what they called the good school jeans. And so the boys had to take turns sharing the good blue jeans that they would wear to school. This is a later picture of Clifford Lee and Hattie McAllister, and here they are surrounded by 12 of their 13 children. Again, this is just a visual to help understand the impact of a family that size, how many children, and what impact financially that would have on parents trying to provide for all these children. The final factor that I would like to discuss that kept people tied to sharecropping was the factor of a limited education and the impact that that had on their lives. To me, in my research, this was the most heartbreaking evidence that I came across. Um, Census records at that time record that most sharecroppers had a very limited education. Many did not complete their elementary level education, and some people, like my two times great grandmother, this would be Clifford Lee's mother, is recorded as not being able to read or write. Not completing their education is of course going to influence their lives in a negative way. Not finishing high school means that they're not eligible simply based on their education for better paying jobs, different types of jobs. Their employment options are limited because their level of education is so low. Some people, like my grandfather, were able as an adult to transition from sharecropping to mill work, but that life was still limited as far as advancements available. There may be some leisure time built in, but their life was still difficult. It was hard work, full of manual labor, and did not present them the same opportunities that they would have had they been able to finish their education. Here you see a selection from the 1940 federal census, and I tried to highlight in red to make it easier to see, but you have Clifford Lee and Hattie McAllister and their children recorded. You see that Clifford Lee is recorded as being 43 years old with a fifth grade education, and Hattie is recorded as 36 years old with a seventh grade education. To me, this put things into perspective. It made things very real. We're talking about actual people, that this is the life that they lived and the reality that they faced. And just, can you imagine being a 43-year-old man with a fifth grade education and expected to provide for your family that would reach 13 children? What do? You fall back on what you know. You turn to what you know. What he knew was farming. What he was surrounded by was sharecropping. And so that's how he found himself there, as a means to provide for his family. It's very sad, but this is the reality of it, and this is, the reality that was faced by a majority of sharecroppers. Here are just a few facts that help prove how prominent limited education was in sharecropping families. Out of Clifford Lee's 13 children, only 2 of his daughters had the opportunity to graduate high school. Some of his children did get the opportunity to learn to read as adults. Like most children of this time, my grandfather had to completely quit school at a young age just to focus on sharecropping and help bring in money for the family. He was able to attend school through the 6th grade. Earlier in the presentation, the question was asked, why would somebody sign up for this system? And the short answer is simply because they didn't have any other choice. The debt trap design of sharecropping and the constraints formed by the factors of familiarity, financial dependence, and limited education left many sharecroppers with no choice but to continue to work in this difficult, non-advancing job. The author Harry Crews uses the phrase, "they had a lack of all other alternatives," and that proves to be true.